I say that I'm from Saami land, and that's very highly tied to the culture. And people don't usually know what is Saami land, so I have to give the answer also that I am from Finnish side of Saami land. But for me it's more important that I come from the Saami culture, and this is what we call our area. And obviously that has to do with identity also, like how do you identify yourself and the area where you live. Because these words that we use to describe where are we from, they do tell about your way of thinking also quite a lot.
The topic of nomadism is really relevant today, because what you can see on the one hand is that you have the nomadism of capital, let's put it like that, the internationalism of capital, which means that big corporations, big lobbies, big monopolies, big Silicon Valley companies, if you want, multinationals, don't know, they don't have borders, they circulate freely, they impose their own culture, let's call it like that. Basically propaganda or tools which we use, and then we get rid of traditional, not only tools, but traditional knowledge which was connected to tools, for instance fishing. And then you also lose the language because you don't use the tools anymore for fishing, so you lose the language. Precisely those who circulate freely, they even can buy a golden visa in Spain, Portugal, Greece, Cyprus for a few millions if they invest in the country. They themselves impose borders and cages for people actually. What we see in Europe today, unfortunately, is that precisely this mixing of culture is disappearing. Not in the sense of the discussion, boring discussion about multiculturalism, I think, but in the sense that what's happening in Italy now, for instance, Salvini is closing ethnic shops because they perceive them, he presents them as places where drug dealers from Arabia come and so on. And I don't know if you remember, a few years ago there was a huge, beautiful discussion in Italy after the government imposed that ethnic how do you call it? Small ethnic restaurants would be closed in Lucca, in Prato, and some small, but also in Milan. Then one of the major Italian chefs came out with I think the best possible statement. He said, are you scared that authentic Italian food will disappear? But do you know that something like authentic Italian food doesn't exist at all? If there wasn't Marco Polo, we wouldn't have pasta. If there wasn't the exploration to Latin America, we wouldn't have tomato. So the two most important ingredients of the authentic Italian food is not Italian. It shows that the big things in history and human life usually come precisely by overpassing boundaries, by taking something which is not your culture and then integrating it in a sense that you go in a kind of dialectical way to a new step of creating something new, which is not this culture, that culture, but something which goes ahead. In Central America, there is this caravan of thousands of people moving towards Mexico and the US border. But did you notice the very name, how they call the caravan? A caravan. I mean, it already sounds as something which is fun, you know, it's a caravan and so on. No, it's a bloody exodus happening. Europe itself is not able to tackle this huge question, because I think the answer has to come from the future, not from the past. You know, it's not the borders, walls are not enough, because even if you have 1 billion people moving in the world, what will you do? So I think that the very concept of citizenship has to be, by the way, that might be NATO or not?
No,
I think that's not NATO.
No, it's a medical helicopter.
Yeah. No, but it brings me to NATO as well, if you want, because I think, I don't know what's happening, but what you have happening now is the biggest NATO exercise since the Cold War. So what you have, I mean, that's maybe a relation between the Saami community and, let's say, some communities living on islands in the Mediterranean Sea, that as much as you can strive for self-determination, autonomy, or whatever this means, you will be confronted by helicopters. And I mean, to put it in a different way, like what we have as a problem on the island is global tourism. which is polluting the beaches. Then, of course, if you go into ecology, you have microplastics. We all eat plastics today. So how can you avoid that?
One example from the Saami experience could be that, as you already know, that we don't really emphasize the borders. At least myself, I don't specifically enjoy identifying myself as someone who comes from Finland, because then I become a Finnish person, which I'm really not. And so I think for Saami it's more natural to think about more the cultural borders, not so much the territorial borders. And I think those are two things that we have to differentiate. And especially now that with the refugee movement, there will be a lot of different cultures mixing. So I think we really need to see that the geographical border and a cultural border, they are different things. We cannot keep them as the same thing. Like the borders of Finland, they cannot define the Finnish people. We should move from nationalistic thinking to more of a human rights way of thinking, to self-determination also. Often what nationalism strives for, it's not really what is causing some of the problems that cause this movement. It's important to also differentiate between cultural nationalism and political nationalism. Like political nationalism strives for establishing borders to a country, while as I see more that the cultural tradition strives for the culture, for the emphasizing of the cultural autonomy. The borders will not matter so much. One of the starting points of the Saami Council in our work is that we should work towards minimizing the impacts of the national borders, because Saami live in the territory of 4 countries, and one of our goals is that the national borders should not stop our unity and our collaboration.
That maybe we should really imagine that the apocalypse already happened, and that we try to survive after the apocalypse. Like in the sense, based on the current knowledge we have, ice is melting here in the Antarctic, new resources will be found. Donald Trump just allowed new drilling of the Arctic, which might bring to a new catastrophe similar to the catastrophe in Gulf of Mexico, which is already there for 12 years, it will be there for 8 years, and so on. So we know all of this. Based on this knowledge, the situation will really be fucked up. And this is just here in the Arctic, not to mention the NATO exercises, not to mention what's happening in Brazil, now with fascism, with Salvini in Italy, with the possibility of a nuclear war. So if we start our thinking and our political action from the presupposition that it already happened, that based on the certain knowledge in 20 years there will not be any ice anymore, there will just be oil spilled all over or whatever, then I think this idea might be liberating and not depressing. Like in the sense that if we go on like this, then we won't be here anymore, and we can't. So in this sense, I mean, we have to think about the temporality, in the sense that our answer has to come from the future, in the sense that this apocalypse is coming from 2040, let's say, in a way, and we really have to rethink radically in the way we treat not only borders, national sovereignty and so on, but nature as well. Which I think also, I'm not nostalgic about traditional communities or whatever. It's really hard to live in a traditional way, it always was. But maybe some of this knowledge can be helpful to resist.
A friend of mine had a really interesting perspective on this, because he said that for sure Saami will exist in 1,000 years, but the Swedish and the Finnish and the Norwegians, they will not exist because of globalization. They will not exist. But the Saami who have gotten so used to struggling for our culture, that we have to stick to our culture, we have to fight for this. We are so used to this that this is the norm, and that's something we can do. So I think yes, we can survive.